Blood and power. These were the twin obsessions that defined Henry VIII's reign. By the winter of 1547, the once mighty king lay rotting in his chambers at Whitehall Palace, the embodiment of a grotesque decline. Renowned for his charm and athletic prowess in his youth, Henry had transformed over the decades into a figure of tyranny and horror, a testament to the burdens of his choices. As he faced his mortality, whispers echoed through the court. The lion is dying. Yet even in his weakened state, his claws remained sharp, reflecting the calculating ruthlessness that had led to the execution of 2 of his wives and countless enemies. The journey to this terrifying finale began decades earlier, when a handsome, vibrant prince ascended the throne in 1509. Henry VIII captivated Europe, his presence characterized by youthful vigor and charm. But how did this Renaissance golden boy devolve into a monstrous tyrant, gasping for breath in the candlelit corridors of Whitehall? The answer lies not only in his infamous marriages, but also in a series of devastating medical catastrophes that twisted both his body and mind beyond recognition. By January 1547, Henry was barely recognizable as the man who once jousted with the finest knights in Christendom. His body became a battlefield of afflictions, a stark contrast to the virility he once exuded. His legs, riddled with festering ulcers that emitted an odor so foul it turned stomachs, illustrated the depths of his despair. As he swelled to nearly 400 pounds, requiring mechanical devices for mobility, the regal image of England's king blurred into that of an ailing behemoth. His once handsome face morphed into a grotesque mask, with sunken eyes and flesh that had taken on a sickly yellow hue, starkly emphasizing his decline. The royal physicians, well-meaning but limited in their understanding, found themselves cornered by the potent cocktail of ailments consuming their sovereign. Bloodletting, herbal concoctions, and fervent prayers proved ineffectual against Henry's deteriorating state. Most modern historians speculate that he suffered from a dangerous mix of type 2 diabetes, gout, and possibly osteomyelitis, a painful bone infection that explained the relentless agony in his legs. Of even greater concern was the slow but profound erosion of the king's mental faculties. Once a symbol of power commanding fear and respect, Henry's legendary temper erupted into explosive rages, interspersed with fits of confused lethargy. The looming specter of death consumed his thoughts as he grappled with the political machinations of succession that convulsed the royal court. His third wife, Jane Seymour, had finally provided a male heir, the frail 9-year-old Edward. But powerful factions, each with competing agendas, were already positioning themselves to control the boy. Once Henry breathed his last. Awash in paranoia, Henry remained acutely aware of the machinations swirling around him. Even in his suffering, he signed execution orders with trembling hands, aware that whispers of his declining health had become one of the kingdom's most guarded secrets. Royal proclamations continued to claim Henry was hale and hearty, while the stark reality told a very different story. Those few permitted into his sick room encountered a macabre scene, the vast royal bed draped in dark fabrics, the air thickening with the sickly sweet smell of decay, barely masked by burning incense, and the once magnificent form of the man who had epitomized the vigor of England now shrouded in misery. Whispers among palace staff revealed the tormented king's agony. The ulcers coursing through his legs caused such excruciating pain that even the slightest movement triggered moments of paralyzing agony. Desperate measures were taken, including the application of bizarre remedies, poultices composed of boiled onions and powdered human skull, desperate treatments adding to his suffering rather than alleviating it. Opium was then applied liberally, dulling pain but clouding a mind that was already slipping away. As his physical body deteriorated, the psychological torment mirrored the agony. The king who once wielded life or death over any subject now found himself betrayed by his own flesh, limited in movement, and beset by near-constant delirium. Court records indicate increasingly erratic behavior, murmurings about the ghosts of executed rivals, and calling out for wives long dead haunted his fragmented thoughts. In moments of clarity, Henry obsessively reviewed his will, attempting to impose his will upon the future of his dynasty even in death. In this maelstrom of physical pain and mental anguish, the king vacillated between religious convictions. Having broken from Rome to declare himself head of the Church of England, he was now haunted by spiritual doubts, demanding Catholic rituals one day and reaffirming Protestant doctrines the next. His personal chaplain recorded instances where the dying king awoke in terror, claiming to see the faces of Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, and other victims standing at the foot of his bed, silently judging him for his past transgressions. The impending doom of Henry's death created a perilous power vacuum, and courtiers rushed to fill the void. The Privy Council fractured into rival factions, each trying to position themselves advantageously for the inevitable regency that would follow. Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, accustomed to his intricate maneuverings due to years spent at court, suddenly found himself outmaneuvered by the Protestant faction. In a final display of Henry's enduring ruthlessness, Norfolk was sentenced to death for treason in the name of the dying king, though fate would intervene, delaying his execution as Henry expired before the order could be enacted. As January 27, 1547, advanced, Henry's final collapse began with violent seizures that forced attendants to hold him down, desperate to prevent injury. When he regained consciousness, he struggled to speak, the right side of his body rendered partially paralyzed, a clear indication of what modern medicine would identify as a stroke. Frightened for their own futures should the king die on their watch, the panicked court physicians worked furiously to revive him, subjecting him to brutal treatments, applying hot irons to his skin and forcing bitter concoctions down his throat in their frantic, ultimately futile attempts to restore the king to health. As the turmoil of Henry's final days unfurled, access to his royal sick room was meticulously controlled by Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury and one of Henry's most trusted advisors. This secrecy served pragmatic purposes beyond mere dignity. News of the king's grave condition could catalyze premature power grabs or even foreign invasion. Cranmer limited entry to only the most essential attendants, each sworn to absolute secrecy regarding the monarch's state. Even Queen Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and surviving wife, found herself kept at a distance during the most critical hours of his decline. As the bitter cold of January turned into the harsh chill of February, Henry drifted in and out of consciousness, his legs unyielding in their agony. The throne that had once commanded awe and fear now lay abandoned under a cancerous veil of decay. There were instances where brief periods of lucidity revealed a growing dread about his imminent judgment. The man who had orchestrated the executions of 2 queens, dozens of nobles, and thousands of common subjects, now stood on the precipice of his own mortality, eyes wide with the haunting realization of his impending fate. Contemporary accounts of Henry's final days furnish vivid glimpses into a once mighty monarch reduced to a shadow of his former self. Attendants recorded how, in feverish delirium, he mumbled prayers, begging for forgiveness, a shocking contrast to the steadfast autocrat who had wrought substantial changes upon England's religious and political landscapes through sheer force of will. In these overwhelming moments of weakness, the extraordinary measures undertaken to preserve Henry's remaining dignity became apparent. As bodily functions gradually failed, teams of servants operated in shifts, tackling the increasing difficulties associated with managing a king whose physical condition had become so dire that even his mere presence sparked discomfort. His ulcerous Legs, described in horror, had become a grotesque memento of his grandeur, a condition so severe that bone was reportedly visible through necrotizing tissue. It was a fate unfathomable for a man who had once been an object of adoration. This repulsive transformation birthed new protocols among those who entered the royal chamber. Perfumed handkerchiefs became essential accessories for anyone who dared approach the decaying figure of their king, whose stench grew increasingly overwhelming. Windows were flung open, despite the biting winter cold, to introduce even a hint of fresh air into the stagnant atmosphere surrounding Henry's bedside. By the time February 27th arrived, even the elaborate pretense that the king might recover was no longer maintainable amidst the circles of courtiers. Cranmer was urgently summoned to the bedside as Henry's breathing grew labored and faint. Accounts from historians and attendants describe a moment filled with a palpable tension, where the king, unable to verbalize his thoughts, was asked to squeeze Cranmer's hand if he placed his faith in Christ rather than in the ceremonies he had once valued. With what little strength remained, Henry reportedly squeezed Cranmer's hand, slipping into a coma shortly thereafter, a detail often cited by Protestant historians as evidence of a late-life conversion to the Protestant faith. The king died in the early hours of January 28, 1547. Even in death, his enormous physical presence dominated the royal chamber, casting a foreboding shadow over the legacy he left behind. His corpse became a grotesque monument to excess and suffering, with the official cause of death recorded simply as natural decay. However, modern forensic analysis points to a more complex demise, likely precipitated by a lethal mixture of heart failure, sepsis stemming from infected wounds, and complications from probable type 2 diabetes. Yet it was not solely the demise of the king that captivated the court in those posthumous hours, but the widespread conspiracy of silence that ensued. The Privy Council, determined to stabilize the political landscape, suppressed the announcement of Henry's death for a full 3 days. This delay proved pivotal, allowing time to consolidate power around young Edward VI, the new king, who was just a child. During this time of strategic maneuvering, while Henry's body lay cooling in the chamber, Edward Seymour, the Earl of Hertford and uncle to Edward VI, moved with ruthless efficiency to secure his position of authority. Behind closed doors, secret meetings took place. Fortresses were fortified and potential rivals neutralized. It was a meticulous orchestration of power politics unfolding upon the death of England's most notorious king. Finally, on January 31st, when the bells of London rang to mark the death of Henry VIII, Edward Seymour had already been named Lord Protector and Duke of Somerset. In a mere flicker of time, he had effectively seized control of England, just as Henry's towering legacy began to dissolve into the annals of history. The task of managing Henry's remains presented uniquely challenging logistical hurdles, illuminating much about Tudor funeral practices and the king's particular physical state at death. Court records reveal that Henry's body began decomposing with alarming rapidity, clearly influenced by the advanced infections that had riddled his system in his waning days. The embalmers, faced with a daunting task, worked feverishly to prepare the remains, removing internal organs and filling the cavities of the body with fragrant herbs and preservatives. Even these skilled professionals were reportedly horrified by the condition of Henry's internal organs, especially his diseased liver and engorged heart. Henry's coffin demanded specialized construction to accommodate his enormous girth. Reports indicate that it measured nearly twice the width of a standard noble's casket. The sheer weight necessitated a reinforced bier and additional bearers for transport to Windsor. During the lying-in state at Whitehall, Witnesses recounted how the lead-lined coffin succumbed to the internal pressure of gases escaping from the decomposing flesh, leading to grotesque leaks that necessitated rapid cover-up efforts. In this macabre spectacle, even as the Tudor regime sought to maintain a dignified facade, the visceral reality of decay seeped through the opulence, contrasting sharply with any public notion of majesty. The funeral procession to Windsor Castle on February 16 provided one last opportunity for the regime to display Henry's power even in death. Black-draped horses pulled the massive coffin through streets lined with mourners, while effigies portrayed Henry as he had appeared in his prime, starkly contrasting the bloated figure that had succumbed to mortality. As Henry IX was laid to rest, a sense of eerie loss coupled with nostalgia for lost grandeur swept across the kingdom. He was finally interred at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, side by side with Jane Seymour, the only wife who had borne him a son and heir. This placement was laden with significance, marking an end to a life steeped in turmoil and wonder. The death of Henry VIII sent tremors through England's political landscape, altering the dynamics of power and authority that had reigned throughout his tumultuous years. With the king's passing, a significant power vacuum emerged, one that ambitious courtiers and nobility hastened to fill amid the uncertainty of young Edward VI's rule. The Privy Council, once dominated by Henry's will, found itself fractured and scrambling to assert dominance over the boy king's regency. A precarious situation with imminent consequences. Edward Seymour, Henry's nephew and newly appointed Lord Protector, swiftly moved to establish control, revealing a cunning ambition that paralleled his late uncle's. With the young boy, so vulnerable and impressionable, Edward grabbed the reins of power with a determination that would shape the future of England. The immediate aftermath of Henry's death witnessed a frenetic race for influence among the councillors and nobles as competing factions sprung from the shadows. Those once loyal to the conservative Catholic doctrines sought to reclaim authority, while reformists eyed the opportunity to extend Protestant reforms. In the vacuum created by Henry's death, the lingering influence of conservative voices led by the Duke of Norfolk became a point of contention. Norfolk and his allies represented the old guard, determined to resurrect the Catholic policies of Henry's earlier rule. Meanwhile, skeptics of Norfolk's faction, primarily composed of reformists and supporters of Edward Seymour, relentlessly plotted to sideline the Duke and his allies. The stakes were high, with everything resting on edicts crafted in the royal chambers that would dictate the ideological direction of the crown. Seymour's rise to power marked a definitive shift in policy, pulling the nation away from Henry's complex and often contradictory practices. The Protestant reformists, emboldened by an atmosphere of potential administrative chaos, swiftly moved to implement changes. Edward Seymour aimed to secure the foothold of Protestantism in the governance of England, taking bold steps towards transforming the religious landscape. The publication of the first English Book of Common Prayer, just 2 years post Henry's death, marked one such radical reform that permanently altered religious practices. At the heart of this political turbulence was the looming question of succession. The meticulously crafted plan left by Henry in his will, which outlined the succession from Edward to Mary and ultimately to Elizabeth, would now be tested against the ambitions of those in power. Edward VI, while the rightful heir, was just a child, lacking the knowledge and experience to navigate the treacherous waters of Tudor politics. This precarious situation led to the rise of symbolic politics as the council guarded a facade of stability. Edward VI was pictured as a strong, definitive leader despite his age, mimicking the posture and presentation of his formidable father. Portraits of the young king echoed those of Henry, capturing his wide-legged stance and confident expression as a means of conveying strength and continuity within the monarchy. Ironically, this emphasis on image masked a deeper instability that simmered beneath the surface of Tudor England. Meanwhile, the public's reaction to Henry's death showcased the sea of anxiety swelling throughout the kingdom. For nearly 4 decades, he had been a pillar of royal authority, and his absence left a palpable void. Parish records from early 1547 indicate widespread fear and uncertainty, with accounts of prophetic dreams, ominous celestial signs, and ghostly apparitions surfacing among the populace. Commoners viewed the death of such a dominant ruler through a lens of superstition and alarm, fearing what the future held for a realm now without a steadfast leader. Internationally, the death of Henry VIII sent shockwaves beyond the shores of England. The French ambassador reflected a profound sense of loss, mourning the death of his dear brother. Meanwhile, Emperor Charles V recognized the strategic ramifications of a child king on the English throne, pondering whether this vulnerability beckoned further foreign interventions. Even Pope Paul III, who had once excommunicated Henry, begrudgingly acknowledged the loss, reportedly offering a mass for the king's soul, an act steeped in political maneuvering that reasserted Catholic claims once the Protestantism surged into more central positions of power. Within the royal household, the physical space where Henry had laid in agony became infused with its own historical significance. Courtiers, once loyal and steadfast, now spoke in hushed whispers, many hesitant to enter the royal chambers where the king had endured his final suffering. Reports emerged soon after of strange noises and inexplicable chill in the very rooms where Henry battled his bodily decay, further fueling superstitions among the court. As political factions jostled for precedence, the lives of Henry's surviving wives and children became intricately intertwined in the web of power dynamics. Catherine Parr, maintaining an air of dignified mourning post-Henry's death, quickly transitioned to a new chapter of her life. With remarkable speed, she sought union with her true love, Thomas Seymour, her affections rekindled almost as swiftly. As they had been shelved during Henry's turbulent reign, Edward, now king in name but heavily controlled by his Seymour uncles, confronted the stark reality of his father's death with disturbing emotional detachment. The emperor's ambassador was commanded to come home on the 4th of January. "Upon the death of the king, my father whose soul got pardon," he recorded brusquely in his journal, a formal entry that betrayed the limited emotional bond between father and son. While Edward ascended the throne, his sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, faced their own precarious situations amid the convoluted political upheaval. Mary, a devout Catholic, found herself increasingly alienated by the reformist agenda spearheaded by her brother's administration. Elizabeth, only 13, navigated court life with acute caution, her position rendered vulnerable due to questions about her legitimacy stemming from her mother's executed status. Yet for all his children, the path to the throne promised danger. They could easily find themselves ensnared in the treacherous politics threatening to swallow them whole. The political turbulence of Edward's elementary reign would manifest in various ways across the subsequent years, leaving an indelible mark not just on the Tudor dynasty, but also on the future of England itself. Paradoxically, while Henry VIII had once embodied all-encompassing autocracy and power, his death initiated a profound transition toward more collaborative forms of governance. Edward Seymour, lacking the intimidating presence of his uncle, relied more heavily on council approval, eschewing the unyielding edicts of Henry's reign. The turbulent aftermath laid the groundwork for England's unique constitutional evolution, allowing bureaucratic systems to develop which could function without direct monarchical oversight. This era proved both an end and a beginning, as Henry's death foreshadowed new governance dynamics that would continue to unfold. As the political landscape shifted dramatically following Henry VIII's death, society grappled with the profound repercussions of his lengthy, tumultuous reign. The burgeoning sense of instability reverberated through both the court and the lives of common subjects alike, caught in the tidal wave of change initiated by the demise of a king whose authority had once ruled with absolute dominance. Henry's passing marked not only the end of an era, but also unleashed an extraordinary examination of his legacy, one that displayed both triumph and destruction. The manner of his death became symbolic of the duality inherent in his rule, embodying the complex relationship between the sovereign and the realm he governed. In the weeks following his death, the court, maneuvering to control Edward VI and his regency, reflected a broader anxiety about governance itself. The Duke of Somerset, now wielding power as Lord Protector, was thrust into a leadership role at a critical juncture, one that would test his political acumen and alignment with Henry's established policies. The new regime struggled between the loyalties forged during Henry's reign and the necessity to assert an identity that would distance itself from the decaying edifice of the former king's tumultuous rule. The appointment of a regency council, composed of 16 men, was intended to create a collective governance structure, reflecting Henry's distrust of individual power. Yet this strategy quickly became undermined as Edward Seymour orchestrated rapid maneuvers to consolidate his authority. He strategically sidelined potential adversaries and commandeered resources, revealing the ruthlessness of ambition that mirrored the late king's own grip on power. Amidst this power struggle, the implications of Henry's strong shift toward Protestantism, complicated by his prior reconciliation with certain Catholic practices, began to emerge more clearly. Under the new government, the long-held Catholic allegiances of many were now viewed as liabilities, with admirable zealists advocating for further reforms. Just as the monarchy underwent a transformation, so too did the very fabric of English society begin to shift. The first Book of Common Prayer in 1549 served as a defining moment in this transition, moving away from the Latin rites and rituals that had characterized Henry's reign and shifting into a distinctly English context. This book reflected a commitment to a more unified Protestant identity, albeit one born from the tumult of Henry's contradictory practices. The complexities of Henry's religious legacy lingered. He had carved a niche for himself as the head of the Church of England, yet the theological convictions underpinning his rule fluctuated severely over his reign. Furthermore, the symbolism surrounding governance and royal authority took on new connotations in the wake of Henry's death. Charles the Spare later attempted to embody this dual role of monarchy and divinity, but his reign would fall prisoner to the very forces Henry had unwittingly unleashed. Through the echelons of power, ornate portraits of young Edward VI echoed those of his father, yet each brushstroke emphasized a shift away from tyranny towards a governance that strived for stability, loyalty, and a sense of national identity. However, the very act of creating a symbolic king, a representation of strength and continuity, only masked the political chaos that erupted in his wake. Left unchecked, rival factions vied for power and influence over Edward VI, feeding into a whirlpool of conspiracies that would threaten not only the stability of the monarchy, but also the unity of the nation. In the vernacular and fears of the populace, Henry's mortality breathed life into manifold anxieties surrounding England's future. His physical decline had become emblematic, a portrait of decay, just as the nation itself faced uncertainties. Common sermons preached parallels between Henry's afflicted body and moral decay growing roots within English society, positing a narrative that urged reformation as a necessity dictated by divine will. In this religious milieu, social unrest simmered beneath the surface. The economic fallout from Henry's extravagance exacerbated public discontent, with monasteries dissolved and riches dispersed, which ultimately led to inflation and dissatisfaction among the populace. The harsh aftermath of the king's lengthy reign would prove destabilizing and fuel discontent in the following years. Catherine Parr, adept in her own political maneuverings, sought to stabilize her own position, showcasing the determined resolve that marked her previous interactions with Henry. After securing her own future of marriage, melding her ambitions with a genuine affection for Thomas Seymour, her story illustrated the shifting alliances that were forever tethered to the whims of court life. Meanwhile, the two sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, continued to maneuver through the treacherous lanes of Tudor politics. Each would claim her path to the throne while navigating a landscape fraught with risks. Mary's allegiance to Catholicism increasingly alienated her from the dominant Protestant milieu, foreshadowing struggles that would resonate throughout her reign. Elizabeth, while learning the delicate art of court survival, would dance on the razor's edge of legitimacy and danger as rumors and potential dissent swirled around her. In understanding the sheer scale of Henry's legacy, it becomes essential to recognize that even the mightiest monarch cannot escape the inexorable truth of mortality. The king who had imposed his will across an empire found himself at the last moments of existence, stripped of titles and transient power, facing eternity stripped bare before God. Contemporary accounts illustrate the depths of his isolation, a lonely figure surrounded by attendants, yet profoundly separated from mankind by the heavy weight of his own authority. In those final hours, Henry's desperate wrestle with existential terror reveals the chilling reality. The man who had executed and sentenced many now found himself grappling with the inevitable finality of death without recourse to power or favor. Individual closeness, friendship, and even familial bonds became irrelevant to the greater specter of mortality. This poignant reminder underscores a fundamental truth. Death is the great equalizer, encompassing both noble and commoner, slicing through the facades of royal grandeur. Thus, as the Tudor dynasty pressed onward in the wake of their most infamous monarch, the ramifications of Henry VIII's reign would reverberate through history. His death marked the transition from monarchical tyranny to a new era of relative cooperation, paving the way for eventual constitutional transformations that would define future governance in England. Though his reign was characterized by ruthless ambition, profound cruelty, and grandiose aspirations, the end of Henry VIII's life offers a complex tapestry woven with ambition, despair, power struggles, and reform. It illustrates how, ultimately, legacy transcends mere actions and titles. It weaves itself into the very fabric of a nation, shaping its future while constantly reflecting the past. And so, the terrifying final days of Henry VIII serve not only as a morbid chapter in the annals of history, but as a vital lens through which we perceive the intertwining themes of power, mortality, and the resilience of human nature itself.